I need you to imagine the worst possible betrayal, not from a stranger, not from an enemy, but from the two people you love most in this world. Now imagine walking in on it. That's exactly what happened to Carrie Walker on what should have been just another warm Houston morning. Welcome to Stories by Mr. Gideon, where we dive into the raw, unfiltered truths of the human heart. I don't just tell stories here, I unravel them, thread by thread, until you see yourself in every twist and turn. If you're ready to feel something real, to sit with the uncomfortable, the devastating, and the ultimately triumphant, then you're exactly where you need to be. Hit that subscribe button, because once you hear Carrie's story, you'll understand why some betrayals don't just break you, they remake you. Now, let's begin. She'd left early for an internship meeting, the kind of routine errand that fills ordinary days. Her mother, Cassie, was downstairs humming gospel hymns while preparing. Breakfast, the soundtrack of Carrie's childhood, the sound of safety. Carrie had decided to come home early, thinking she'd surprise her fiancé, Oliver, with pancakes and maybe steal a quiet moment before the wedding chaos consumed them. You see, they were getting married in just 2 days. 2 days. The dress was hanging in the closet. The flowers were ordered. The future was supposed to be certain. But as Carrie turned the doorknob and stepped into her own house, she heard something that turned her blood to ice. Soft moans. The rustling of sheets, coming from the master bedroom, her bedroom. Now, you might think you know where this is going. You might think you can predict the next moment. But let me tell you, knowing something intellectually and experiencing it viscerally are two entirely different universes. Carrie's heart didn't just pound, it detonated. The walls seemed to close in, the air got thinner, and every step toward that bedroom door felt like walking toward the edge of a cliff she couldn't see but knew was there. She opened the door just a crack, just enough to peer inside. And what she saw didn't just break her heart, it shattered her entire sense of reality. Her mother, Cassie, lay in the bed, half covered by white sheets. And leaning over her, his hands tangled in Cassie's long black hair, kissing her neck with an intimacy that made Carrie's stomach turn, was Oliver, her fiancé. The man she was supposed to marry in 48 hours. His lips moved against Cassie's skin. Her mother's eyes were closed, her mouth forming his name in a whisper of pleasure. They were so lost in each other that for several excruciating seconds they didn't even notice Carrie standing there, watching her entire world implode. She stumbled backward into the hallway, chest heaving, breath coming in ragged gasps. The adrenaline hit her system like a freight train. She couldn't cry, couldn't scream, couldn't process every memory she'd built around these two people, every Sunday dinner with Mom, every late night conversation with Oliver, every dream of their future together, crumbled into dust in an instant. Cassie, the word came out as barely a whisper. Her mother jerked upright, clutching the sheet to her chest like it could somehow provide dignity in this moment. Oliver froze beside her, his eyes going wide with a panic that would have been almost comical if it wasn't so devastating. "Carrie," he croaked, his voice breaking on her name. Cassie's face went ashen. This wasn't a nightmare. This was unbearably, horrifically real. "Baby, Cassie started, her voice trembling. "Don't call me that." The words exploded out of Carrie with a force that surprised even her. "Mom, what on earth is going on? And you, Oliver, how could you do this to me?" Tears filled Cassie's eyes, spilling down her cheeks. "Carrie, I never meant—" The sobs choked off whatever excuse was about to follow. "A mistake," Carrie demanded, her voice shaking with a cocktail of rage and devastation. "A mistake? Does this look like a mistake? My own mother in bed with my fiancé." She stumbled back against the wall, the room spinning. "I loved you, Oliver. I thought you loved me. But you used me. And you, Mom, I always thought you were stronger than this. How could you betray me like that?" Oliver's face burned crimson with guilt. "Carrie, I'm so sorry. I swear it meant nothing. I love you, not her." The lie hung in the air like smoke. Cassie fell to her knees on the bedroom floor, still clutching that sheet, crying so hard her whole body shook. "Carrie, honey, I love you. I made a terrible mistake. I never wanted to hurt you. But Carrie couldn't stand there anymore. The room was spinning. Her knees were giving out, and if she didn't leave, right that second, she was going to collapse right there in front of them. She bolted from the room, practically falling down the stairs, and ended up curled on the living room floor, crying so hard she couldn't breathe. Every step had felt like walking on broken glass. She could hear Cassie calling her name from upstairs, but she covered her ears trying to block it out. Nothing made sense. The betrayal was so complete, so total, that her mind couldn't find a single handhold to grip. Everywhere she looked in that living room were photographs. Mom and Carrie as a little girl, Oliver teaching, her to ride a bike, family vacations in Galveston, and every single one felt like a cruel, elaborate lie. She sat there on that floor, heart pounding, completely numb, until something inside her shifted. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, she wiped her eyes and took a deep, shuddering breath. She couldn't leave things like this. She couldn't run. Not yet. Trembling, Carrie stood up and walked back upstairs, back into the lion's den, back into the room where everything had fallen apart. Cassie was still sitting on the bed, now wrapped in a robe. Oliver stood by the door, both of them crying softly. They flinched when they saw her approach, probably expecting rage, probably expecting her to throw them both out into the street. But what came out of Carrie's mouth next shocked even her. "We're getting married in 2 days," she said, her voice trembling but steady. "That was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. I love you, Oliver. I love you, Mom." Her eyes filled with fresh tears. "You have to promise me something. Promise me this will never happen again. I will forgive you both, but only if you stop all this now." Cassie bowed her head, tears streaming down her face. "Carrie, thank you. It won't happen again. I promise." Oliver stepped forward, his voice breaking. "Carrie, I swear I will make this right. You won't ever have to worry again." And just like that, Carrie made a choice that would haunt her for months to come. She chose forgiveness over fury. She chose hope over heartbreak. She chose to believe that love could be stronger than betrayal. But here's the question I need you to sit with as we head into what happens next when someone shows you who they really are, when they betray you in the deepest way possible. Is forgiveness actually love, or is it just fear of being alone? If Carrie's story is gripping your soul right now, if you're sitting there wondering what you would have done in that bedroom, in that impossible moment, then do me a favor. Don't just subscribe. Commit. Hit that notification bell, because Act 2 is going to take you places you're not ready for, and I need you to be there when it drops. Drop a comment and tell me, would you have walked down that aisle, or would you have walked away? I read every single one, and your perspective might just change how someone else sees their own story. This is Stories by Mr. Gideon, and we're just getting started. 2 days after discovering the unthinkable, Carrie Walker walked down the aisle anyway. And that decision, that seemingly impossible choice to forgive and move forward, was about to become the biggest mistake of her life. Picture this: a sunlit Houston church, stained glass windows casting rainbow patterns. Across polished wooden pews, the scent of roses and lilies heavy in the air. Carrie stood in the bridal suite, her hands trembling so violently that her bridesmaids had to hold the bouquet steady while she gripped it. They'd braided her hair into an intricate updo and pinned her veil just so, but no amount of hairspray or makeup could hide the storm raging behind her eyes. Every few seconds her breath would hitch, and she'd have to remind herself, breathe in, breathe out, stay present. Don't think about what you saw in that bedroom 48 hours ago. Her maid of honor, Alicia, slipped into the room and immediately took Carrie's hand. "You look so beautiful," she whispered. And there was something in her voice. Concern, maybe, or confusion about why this wedding was even happening. Carrie squeezed back, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow even to her own ears. "I feel like my knees might give out," she admitted, which was the truest thing she'd said in 2 days. But here's what you need to understand about that moment. Carrie wasn't just nervous. She was making a calculated bet with her entire future. She was gambling that love, real, true, unconditional love, could overpower betrayal. That forgiveness could rebuild what deception had destroyed. That if she just believed hard enough, tried hard enough, loved hard enough, she could make this work. Have you ever bet everything on a single belief? Have you ever ignored every red flag, every warning sign, every instinct screaming at you to run because you wanted so desperately to believe in something? Carrie had. The ceremony began with Uncle Tony's deep, resonant voice, welcoming everyone to witness this union. Across the aisle, Carrie could see her family, Aunt Florence in an enormous hat that probably blocked 3 people's view, her cousins in bright dresses that popped against the church's cream-colored walls. All of them smiling like this was the happiest day of their lives. On the other side sat Oliver's parents in sharp suits, his mother dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. Nobody knew. Not a single person in that church knew what had happened 2 days ago. They had no idea they were witnessing a performance, not a celebration. When it came time for vows, Carrie's voice cracked on the word faithful. She saw Oliver's jaw tighten, saw the flash of guilt in his eyes before he masked it with a smile. But she pushed through, repeating every word Uncle Tony fed her, making promises she wasn't even sure she believed anymore. And when Uncle Tony finally announced, "You may kiss the bride," Oliver leaned in and Carrie kissed him fully, letting the crowd's eruption of cheers wash over her like absolution. In that moment she thought, she genuinely believed, that maybe, just maybe, hope could win. The reception at 3rd Ward was everything a Houston wedding should be. Gospel music played softly from speakers while friends and family danced in. The courtyard under strings of lights that twinkled like earthbound stars. They cut the cake together, and someone, probably one of Oliver's groomsmen, playfully pressed a piece into Carrie's nose, and she laughed. God, she actually laughed, a real genuine sound that surprised her because it was. The first time in days that joy hadn't felt like a lie she was telling herself. Cassie pulled her aside then, smoothing the sash on Carrie's dress with maternal care, whispering, "I'm so proud of you." And Carrie hugged her tight, so tight, because despite everything, despite the betrayal, despite the image burned into her brain of her mother in bed with her now husband, she still loved her, still wanted her mother's approval, still craved that connection. Isn't that the cruelest part of betrayal? How it doesn't erase love, just twists it into something painful and complicated. Later that night, Oliver pulled Carrie out onto a balcony overlooking the city. Houston's lights spread out before them like a galaxy, and for a moment it felt like they were the only 2 people in the world. He kissed her forehead, a gesture so tender it made her chest ache, and said, "Thank you for giving us this chance." Carrie rested in his arms, letting herself believe that everything would be okay, that this was the turning point, that from here on out, it would all be different. But belief and reality are 2 very different things. That night, they flew to Galveston for their honeymoon. The island breeze was warm and salty, exactly the kind of coastal air that's supposed to cleanse and renew. They walked on the beach at sunrise, bare feet leaving temporary prints in the sand that the tide would soon erase, a metaphor Carrie didn't catch at the time but would understand later. Oliver held her hand and pointed out seashells like they were precious gems, and when she collected too many and filled her pockets, he laughed with such genuine amusement that she almost forgot. Almost. In their beachfront cottage, Oliver made breakfast. Bacon and eggs, buttered toast, fresh fruit and jam spread out on the little table by the window. "I love you, Bacon," Carrie joked when she bit into a crispy piece, and Oliver laughed and kissed her. And for those few minutes, everything felt normal. Later, lying in bed with the ocean breeze drifting through open windows, he kissed her softly and tenderly, and they made love with a gentleness that felt like both a promise and an apology. When Carrie fell asleep in his arms that night, she was finally at peace, truly believing that perhaps love could conquer everything. She was wrong. Back in Houston a few weeks later, life settled into what appeared to be a calm routine. Carrie threw herself into her work at the magazine, covering art exhibits and writing profiles of local gallery owners, losing herself in stories about other people's creative visions because it was easier than examining her own life too closely. Oliver went back to work at his office downtown, leaving early, and coming home late, which he said was normal for this time of year. They shared morning coffee on their porch, and for a while Carrie told herself everything was normal. She told herself the doubts were just lingering trauma from that awful discovery. She told herself she was healing. But then the little things started. It began so innocuously she almost dismissed it. One morning, Carrie opened the bathroom cabinet looking for toothpaste and found 2 identical electric toothbrushes, the same model, the same color, sitting side by side. She and Oliver used different brands. She stood there staring at those toothbrushes for a full minute, her mind trying to construct an innocent explanation. Maybe Oliver bought a backup. Maybe one was old and he'd replaced it. But the doubt had been planted, a tiny seed that would soon grow into something impossible to ignore. A few days later, she found a note stuck to the fridge, magnetized in place, written, in Cassie's distinctive looping handwriting, "Don't forget to water the plants." Carrie stared at it. They didn't have any new plants. When she asked Oliver about it that evening, he barely looked up from his laptop. "Oh yeah, Mom stopped by earlier. She must have left that for herself and forgot to take it." The explanation was plausible, reasonable even. But something about the casual way he delivered it made Carrie's stomach twist. Then came the lotion. Carrie woke up from an afternoon nap one Saturday. Oliver had said he was running errands. And there, on her nightstand, right next to her water glass, was a bottle of lavender-scented hand lotion. Not just any lavender lotion. Cassie's lavender lotion. The specific brand her mother had used for years, the scent so distinctive that Carrie would recognize it anywhere. Her skin crawled. Oliver was already gone, and when she called him, he didn't answer. She sat there on the edge of the bed, holding that bottle, and felt the foundation of her carefully rebuilt world start to crack. Do you know what it's like to feel crazy in your own life? To have all these pieces of evidence that don't quite add up, but aren't quite damning enough to confront? It's like drowning in slow motion. Every day, another inch of water. Every day, breathing becomes a little harder. But everyone around you says you're fine. The water's not even that deep. Why are you panicking? Even at church on Sunday, Carrie couldn't escape it. When a stranger gave her the peace sign during the greeting portion of the service, she caught a whiff of that perfume, Cassie's perfume. She whipped around, scanning the pews, but her mother wasn't there. Of course she wasn't. Cassie had supposedly gone back to Pittsburgh weeks ago, but the scent lingered, mixing with the smell of old hymnals and furniture. Polish, and Carrie had to grip the pew in front of her to steady herself. She started watching Oliver's face more closely, looking for tells, signs, proof. And here's the thing, she found them. The way his eyes would slide away when she asked about his day, the way he'd check his phone obsessively and then hide the screen when she walked into the room, the way he'd shower immediately when he got home from work, even on days when he claimed he'd been in meetings all afternoon. Individually, these things meant nothing. Together, they painted a picture Carrie didn't want to see but couldn't stop staring at. Her friend Kendra noticed something was wrong during brunch one Sunday at their favorite spot downtown. Over omelettes and mimosas, Kendra reached across the table and took Carrie's hand. "You all right, girl?" she asked gently, her eyes full of concern. And Carrie wanted to tell her everything, wanted to spill it all out, the affair, the wedding, the doubts, the fear that she'd made a catastrophic mistake. But instead, she lied. "I'm fine, just a little stressed with work." The words tasted like ash in her mouth. But inside, Carrie was unraveling. Thread by thread, day by day, her carefully maintained composure was coming apart. The clues were piling up in her mind like evidence at a crime scene, and she couldn't ignore them anymore. She started having nightmares, dreams where she'd walk into her bedroom and find Oliver and Cassie, there again, except this time they wouldn't stop, wouldn't even acknowledge her presence. She'd wake up gasping, covered in sweat, and Oliver would be right there beside her, breathing softly, and she'd wonder if he was dreaming about her mother. Can you imagine living like that? Sharing a bed with someone you're starting to suspect is still betraying you. It's torture. It's a special kind of hell where everything looks normal on the surface, but underneath, everything's rotting. One evening changed everything. Carrie was driving home from a late meeting at the magazine, taking a route that happened to pass through Cassie's old neighborhood, the area where her mother had lived before supposedly moving back to Pittsburgh. The streetlights were just coming on, casting long shadows across the sidewalks. And as Carrie stopped at a red light, she glanced to her right. There, on a porch with the light still on, was a figure she'd recognize anywhere. Cassie, waving at someone. Smiling that smile Carrie had known her whole life. Carrie's heart lurched so violently, she thought she might be having a heart attack. Her hands tightened on the steering wheel until her knuckles went white. The light turned green, but she couldn't move. Behind her, someone honked, and she jumped, accelerating through the intersection with her mind racing. Cassie had never mentioned coming back to Houston, had never said anything about visiting. In fact, she'd sent Carrie several texts over the past weeks talking about Pittsburgh, about the weather there, about reconnecting with old friends. All lies. All carefully constructed lies. That night, Carrie couldn't sleep. She lay beside Oliver, listening to him breathe, and remembered something from years ago, a project she'd done for the magazine on local property records, investigating gentrification patterns in historic Houston neighborhoods. She'd learned how to search public records, how to track property sales, how to find out who owned what. On a hunch that made her stomach churn, she hired a private investigator the next morning. His name was Marcus Webb, a former police detective who now did freelance work, and when she met him at a coffee shop in Midtown, she felt like she was starring in a movie about someone else's life. This couldn't be real. She couldn't actually be hiring someone to follow her husband and mother, but she slid an envelope with cash across the table and gave him all the information he needed. 2 days later, 2 days of barely eating, barely sleeping, jumping every time her phone rang, Marcus called. Carrie was at work, sitting at her desk pretending to edit an article about a new sculpture installation downtown, when her phone buzzed. She answered on the first ring. "Ms. Walker," Marcus said quietly, and she could hear in his voice that he'd found something. "We've confirmed your suspicion." Those 4 words landed like bombs. "Your mother bought a townhouse 5 months ago. The deed lists Oliver Hart as the seller." He paused, letting that sink in. "We have photos of her car parked there weekly, time-stamped receipts from restaurants they dined at together, text messages we retrieved from phone records. Ms. Walker, I'm sorry, but they never stopped seeing each other." Carrie's hands went icy, despite the Houston heat filtering through her office window. 5 months ago. That was before the wedding. Before the honeymoon. Before all those promises they'd made. The entire time, every single day since she'd caught them, they'd been lying to her face. The toothbrush made sense now. The note made sense. The lotion, the perfume, Oliver's late nights, his obsessive phone checking, all of it made horrible, perfect sense. She thanked Marcus, hung up, and sat perfectly still at her desk for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Around her, the magazine office hummed with normal activity. Co-workers, typing, phones ringing, someone laughing at a joke by the water cooler. The world was continuing as if nothing had changed. As if Carrie's entire reality hadn't just shattered for the second time. But here's what you need to understand about this moment. The first betrayal had been shocking, devastating, world-ending. But this second revelation, this confirmation that they'd never stopped, that her forgiveness had been exploited, that her hope had been weaponized against her, this was worse. Because the first time she could tell herself it was a mistake, a moment of weakness. But this was a choice. A sustained, deliberate, calculated choice to keep lying to her every single day, while she tried to rebuild trust they had no intention of honoring. Have you ever felt that kind of rage? The kind that's so pure and cold it doesn't even feel hot. It's not the explosive anger that makes you scream and throw things. It's the ice-cold fury that makes you go completely still and see everything with perfect, terrible clarity. That's what Carrie felt sitting at that desk. Clarity. She left work early, got in her car, and drove directly to the address Marcus had given her. A townhouse in Midtown, nice neighborhood, tree-lined street, the kind of place young professionals aspire to own. Oliver had sold their house, the house they'd bought together, that they'd planned to fill with children and memories and all the trappings of a normal life, to buy this place for her mother. The math was simple and devastating. Carrie parked across the street and sat there for a moment, gathering herself. Through the front window, she could see movement. Lights on, people home, her husband and her mother. Playing house, probably thinking they'd gotten away with it, probably congratulating themselves on how well they'd fooled her. The thought made her want to vomit. She got out of the car and crossed the street. Her legs felt steady now, purpose overriding shock. She walked up to that front door and knocked. 3 sharp raps that sounded like judgment itself. Cassie opened the door. For a second, maybe 2, they just stared at each other. Carrie watched the color drain from her mother's face, watched recognition and fear dawn in her eyes. "Carrie," Cassie breathed, but it wasn't a greeting. It was a prayer that had come too late. "Can I come in?" Carrie asked, her voice eerily calm. She didn't wait for an answer. She walked past her mother into the living room, and there, standing by the window like he'd been frozen mid-motion, was Oliver. He looked exactly like someone who'd been caught. Again, they both stood there, frozen, probably running through every possible explanation, every lie they might construct. But Carrie didn't give them the chance. "Cassie," she said quietly, using that same calm voice that felt like it belonged to someone else. "I thought you said you'd gone back to Pittsburgh." Cassie's face crumpled. Carrie held up a hand. She was amazed at how steady it was. "Oliver," she continued, turning to face her husband. "Care to explain this?" She pulled out the folder Marcus had given her. Photos, documents, receipts, a whole dossier of betrayal compiled into a neat package. "Care to tell me why my mother is still here 5 months later? Why you sold our house? Why you've been lying to my face every single day since our wedding?" The silence that followed was so complete, Carrie could hear the refrigerator humming in the kitchen. Finally, Oliver swallowed hard. His face had gone pale, but there was something else there too. Relief, maybe. Like being caught was almost a mercy after months of lying. "Carrie," he started, and his voice cracked. I owe you the truth." He took a shuddering breath. "Cassie and we fell in love years ago, long before you and I even met." Wait, stop, rewind. Did you catch that? Years ago. Before Carrie even entered the picture. This wasn't an affair that had developed recently. This wasn't a moment of weakness that spiraled. This was... What? What do you even call it when your fiancé has been sleeping with your mother since before you were together? When your entire relationship was built on a foundation of deception so profound, it rewrites your entire history. Oliver continued, words tumbling out now like confession at a crime scene. "I never meant to hurt you. I thought, God, this sounds insane, but I thought I could have both of you. I wanted both of you. I know now that was selfish and cruel and completely impossible, but I kept trying to make it work. I kept thinking I could balance it, that I could love you both and nobody would get hurt." He laughed, a bitter sound. "I understand if you hate me. I hate myself." Cassie had sunk onto the couch, sobbing openly now. "Carrie, baby, I'm so sorry," she cried. And Carrie felt a flash of rage at the word baby, that maternal endearment weaponized in a moment like this. "I never wanted to hurt you. After your father left, I felt so alone. And then Oliver, we just connected. I know that's not an excuse. I know I'm your mother, and I should have been stronger. I should have walked away. But I didn't think about the pain it would cause. I only thought about not being lonely anymore." Carrie stood there, listening to these 2 people she'd loved most in the world, and felt something inside her go very quiet and very still. The rage was still there, but it was contained now, purposeful. She understood something in that moment that would change her forever. You can't save people who are determined to destroy you. You can't love someone into being honest. You can't forgive your way into a relationship that was never real to begin with. "So this was your plan," she said softly, looking between them. "You both kept me in the dark on purpose. You built this elaborate lie, the wedding, the promises, the honeymoon, all of it. knowing the entire time you were going to keep seeing each other. Oliver shook his head desperately. I sold our house to buy this place because I wanted... He stopped, realizing how it sounded. Yes, that's what I did. I'm sorry. The pieces fell into place with terrible finality. Every late night Oliver had claimed to be working, he was here. Every time Cassie said she was in Pittsburgh, she was here. Every morning Carrie had kissed her husband goodbye and told him she loved him. He'd been planning to come here. To this townhouse, to her mother. While Carrie was building a life with him, he was building a separate life that had nothing to do with her, except that it required her continued ignorance to function. Do you understand what that does to a person? To realize you were never a wife, you were a cover story, that your entire marriage was just an elaborate deception designed to make their affair more convenient? I loved you both, Carrie said, and was surprised to find her voice still steady. I loved you both more than I've ever loved anyone, but I can't be anyone's secret. I can't be the fool you both lied to every single day while you lived the life you actually wanted. They watched her, tears streaming down both their faces. Cassie started to stand, reaching for her, but Carrie took a step back. Get out, she said quietly. The words hung in the air. Get out of my life and never come back. You've taken enough. Carrie, please, Cassie started. Save it. Carrie cut her off. She turned and walked toward the door, her legs somehow still working, her body somehow still functioning, even though she felt like she was watching herself from a distance. She opened that door, stepped out into the Houston night, and didn't look back. Behind her, she could hear them calling her name, but she kept walking, one foot in front of the other, away from the townhouse, away from the lies, away from them. She got in her car, drove 3 blocks, pulled over, and finally let herself fall apart. The sobs came from somewhere deep and primal, a sound she didn't recognize as her own. She cried until there was nothing left, until she was empty and hollow and wrung out. And then, when the tears finally stopped, she started the car again and drove home. But here's the thing, and this is what kept her moving through the next few hours. She wasn't driving home to the house she'd shared with Oliver. That wasn't home anymore. That had never really been home. It had been a stage set for a play she hadn't known she was performing in. Real home would have to be something she built herself, for herself, with no lies buried in the foundation. That night, Carrie began packing. She moved through the house like a ghost, filling boxes with her belongings, separating her life from Oliver's with mechanical precision. Every object was a choice, keep it or leave it behind. Every piece of furniture, every book, every kitchen appliance, she divided their shared life into mine and not mine, and discovered how little of it had ever really belonged to her. She found their wedding album in the closet and stood there for a long moment, holding it. All those photos of her smiling, believing, hoping. The girl in those pictures looked so innocent, so stupidly, tragically innocent. Carrie took the album and put it in the donation pile. Someone else could have those photos. Someone else could believe in whatever fairy tale they wanted to project onto those images. Carrie was done with fairy tales. By dawn, she'd packed everything that mattered into her car. She called a real estate agent and listed the house. Whatever money came from the sale, she didn't. At Care, she'd split it with Oliver, or give it all to him, or burn it for all it mattered. Money couldn't fix this. Nothing could fix this, but she could walk away. She could choose herself for once. She found a small apartment in the museum district, 1 bedroom, hardwood floors, big windows that let in morning light. It was just for her. No shared space, no compromised decorating decisions, no accommodating someone else's schedule or preferences, just hers. When she signed the lease, her hand didn't shake. And here's the question I need you to sit with as we move toward the resolution. How do you rebuild yourself when everything you thought you knew about your life was a lie? How do you learn to trust again when the 2 people who should have been safest were the ones who hurt you most? And most importantly, can you come back from that? Can anyone? Because that's what I'm about to show you. But right now, Carrie stood in that empty apartment with nothing but boxes and heartbreak, and had to figure out if she even wanted to try. So here's the question that probably kept you up at night after Act 2. Can Carrie actually rebuild her life after a betrayal that deep? Can anyone really come back from discovering their entire marriage was a lie? Most people would tell you no. Most people would say that kind of damage is permanent, that trust once shattered can never be whole again. But what if I told you that sometimes the only way to find yourself is to lose everything you thought you were? Stay with me, because Carrie's journey through the darkness is about to teach us something profound about the human capacity for resilience. That first night in the Museum District apartment, Carrie didn't sleep. She sat on the bare hardwood floor with her back against the wall, surrounded by boxes she didn't have the energy to unpack, and watched the city lights flicker through her window. Houston hummed outside, cars passing, distant sirens, the soundtrack of a city that never really sleeps. And for the first time in months she felt something unexpected. Not peace, not yet, but space. Room to breathe without wondering who was lying to her. Room to think without calculating what truth was being hidden. Just space. She'd brought almost nothing with her when you got down to it. Clothes, books, a few photographs of her and her cousins from childhood before everything got complicated. She'd left behind the wedding china, the fancy furniture Oliver had insisted on buying, the art they'd chosen together for their walls. All of it felt contaminated now, touched by deception, and she wanted none of it. Better to start with nothing than to build on a foundation of lies. But here's what nobody tells you about leaving. The hard part isn't the dramatic exit. It's not the confrontation, or the packing, or even the signing of the lease on a new place. The hard part is the morning after, and the morning after that, and all the mornings that follow when you wake up and have to actively choose to keep going, to keep building, to keep believing that this pain has a purpose. Carrie's phone had been ringing non-stop since she'd left the townhouse. Oliver called 17 times that first night. Cassie called 12. She didn't answer. Couldn't answer. What was left to say? They'd said everything that mattered in that townhouse, and now all that remained was the noise of their guilt trying to find absolution in her forgiveness. But Carrie was done being their priest, done being their redemption story. They'd have to find their own way to live with what they'd done. On the third day, Kendra showed up at the apartment with groceries and takeout from Carrie's favorite soul food place. She took one look at Carrie sitting on the floor, still in the same clothes from 2 days ago, and just sat down beside her. Didn't ask questions, didn't demand explanations, just sat there, opened up the containers of fried chicken and mac and cheese and collard greens, and started eating. After a while, Carrie picked up a fork and joined her. "You gonna tell me what happened?" Kendra finally asked, her voice gentle. And Carrie did. She told her everything. The discovery before the wedding, the decision to forgive, the honeymoon that felt like hope, the slow realization that nothing had changed. Hiring the investigator, the townhouse, the confrontation, all of it. The words poured out of her like water from a broken dam, and Kendra listened without interrupting, her face cycling through shock and rage and heartbreak on Carrie's behalf. When Carrie finally finished, Kendra was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something Carrie would never forget. "Girl, you know what the difference is between giving up and letting go?" She didn't wait for an answer. Giving up is when you stop fighting because you're weak. Letting go is when you stop fighting because you're strong enough to know the fight isn't worth winning. What you did, that wasn't giving up. That was the strongest thing you could have done. Those words settled into Carrie's chest and made a home there. The strongest thing you could have done. She repeated them in her head like a mantra over the following weeks. Because here's the truth about healing. It doesn't happen in one dramatic moment. It's not a switch you flip or a decision you make once and then you're done. Healing is a choice you make every single day, sometimes every single hour, to keep choosing yourself, even when every instinct screams at you to go back to what's familiar. Carrie's cousins started showing up too. They brought casseroles and pound cake and stories about their own heartbreaks, their own moments of having to choose themselves. They brought photo albums from when Carrie was little, reminding her of who she was before Oliver, before the betrayal, before any of this. "Look, Here's 6-year-old Carrie at the church picnic, gap-toothed and grinning. Here's teenage Carrie at her high school graduation, full of dreams and possibility. That person was still in there somewhere, buried under months of gaslighting and deception, and they were helping her excavate who she used to be. But even with all that support, there were dark moments. Nights when Carrie would wake up at 3 in the morning and reach for Oliver before remembering he wasn't there, would never be there again. Mornings when she'd see something funny and think, I have to tell Mom about this, before the memory crashed over her like a wave. Grief is strange that way. It doesn't ask permission, doesn't follow a schedule. It ambushes you in the grocery store when you see Cassie's favorite brand of coffee. It sucker punches you when a song comes on the radio that played at your wedding. One Sunday morning, about 2 weeks after the confrontation, Carrie made herself get dressed and go to church. She almost turned back 3 times on the drive there. What would people say? What would they think? Did everyone know? But when she walked through those doors, Aunt Florence was there with her ridiculous hat and her enormous hug, and she pulled Carrie close and whispered, "Baby girl, we don't talk about your business, but we sure do pray for your strength." And just like that, Carrie understood she wasn't alone in this. The choir director, Sister Patricia, caught her after service. "We've missed your voice," she said simply. "You coming back to choir practice this Wednesday?" And Carrie heard herself say yes before her brain could talk her out of it. That Wednesday, she stood in the choir loft with 20 other voices surrounding her, and when they launched into his eyes on the sparrow, something inside her cracked open. She sang through tears, her voice shaking but holding the notes, and for the first time since everything fell apart, she felt like maybe she was still whole. Damaged, yes. Changed, absolutely. But not broken beyond repair. Can I tell you something about music? About how it reaches parts of you that words can't touch? Standing in that choir loft, Carrie wasn't thinking about Oliver or Cassie or betrayal or any of it. She was just singing, just being present in that moment, and that presence, that ability to be fully in the now, without being haunted by the past or terrified of the future. That was the first real healing she'd experienced. She started going to choir practice every Wednesday and singing every Sunday. The routine helped. The structure, knowing that every week she'd show up and use her voice for something beautiful instead of just replaying the ugly scenes in her head. Sister Patricia would sometimes squeeze her shoulder after particularly emotional songs, a silent acknowledgement that she saw Carrie's pain and was proud of her for showing up anyway. Around this same time, Carrie started volunteering at the Museum of Fine Arts. She'd always loved art. It was part of what drew her to her job at the magazine, and now she signed up to help with the children's workshops on Saturday mornings. Little kids, mostly ages 5 to 10, coming in to make art and express themselves without the weight of the world on their shoulders yet. And watching them create, seeing the pure joy on their faces when they painted a tree or sculpted a clay animal or glued together a collage, reminded Carrie that beauty could come from chaos. That creation was always possible, even when destruction felt inevitable. There was this one little girl, couldn't have been more than 7, named Maya. She came in one Saturday with her grandmother and sat at the table looking scared and uncertain. Carrie knelt down beside her and asked what she wanted to make. Maya shrugged, picking at the corner of the blank paper in front of her. "I don't know how to make anything good," she whispered, and Carrie felt that sentence in her soul. "You know what?" Carrie said softly. "Good is boring. How about we make something real instead?" She pushed the paints closer. "What's the biggest feeling you've had this week?" Maya thought about it, then pointed to the black paint. "Sad," she said. "My goldfish died." So they painted sadness together. Big black swirls with little spots of gold mixed in, because even in sadness, there are moments of light. By the end of the session, Maya was smiling, and her grandmother had tears in her eyes thanking Carrie for being so patient. But here's what Maya's grandmother didn't know. Carrie wasn't just helping Maya. Maya was helping Carrie. Every child who showed her a painting, every proud smile, every moment of creative expression, was teaching Carrie that she could make something beautiful out of broken pieces. That destruction doesn't have to be the end of the story. That you can take the scattered fragments of your life and arrange them into something new, something that might not look like what you originally planned, but has its own kind of beauty. Does that make sense? How sometimes the people we think we're helping are actually saving us. Carrie kept most of the reminders of her old life locked away in boxes in her closet. The wedding photos, the gifts from Oliver, their wedding portrait that someone had professionally framed. One day, about a month into living in the apartment, she pulled those boxes out and sat with them. Really sat with them. Looked at every photo, held every gift, remembered every moment. And then she took all of it, every last piece, and donated it to Goodwill. Let someone else find joy in those picture frames and vases and decorative items. They meant nothing to her now. They were artifacts from someone else's life. The only thing she kept was a single photo from the wedding, not of her and Oliver, but of her with her cousins and Aunt Florence, all of them laughing at something someone had said. That photo she put on her mantle because those relationships were real. Those people showed up for her when everything crumbled. They earned their place in her new life. Letting go of those physical objects felt symbolic, like a ritual of release. But the real work of forgiveness, forgiving Oliver and Cassie, forgiving herself for staying, for believing, for trying so hard to make it work, that was harder and took longer. Carrie realized she was angry at herself almost more than she was angry at them. How could she have been so stupid? How could she have ignored the signs? How could she have let them treat her that way? But here's what Kendra helped her understand over many late-night conversations. Carrie wasn't stupid. She was human. She wanted to believe that love could overcome betrayal because that's a beautiful thing to believe. She wanted to trust that the people she loved most would choose her, would honor their promises, would value her enough to be honest. Those weren't character flaws. Those were hopes. And hoping isn't weakness. It's courage. Still, forgiving herself took work. Carrie started seeing a therapist, Dr. Michelle Carson, a black woman in her 50s who'd been practicing for decades and had kind eyes that somehow made you feel safe telling her anything. In their first session, Carrie told her everything, and when she finished, Dr. Carson asked her, "One question, if your best friend came to you with this exact story, what would you tell her?" And Carrie immediately said, "I'd tell her she deserved better, that none of it was her fault, that she was brave for leaving." Dr. Carson just smiled. "So why can't you tell yourself the same thing?" That question rewrote something in Carrie's brain. Why couldn't she extend the same grace to herself that she'd give someone she loved? Why was she holding herself to an impossible standard of perfection that she'd never demand from anyone else? Over the following weeks and months, Dr. Carson helped Carrie work through those questions. Helped her see that self-compassion wasn't self-indulgence. It was survival. They talked about boundaries, about what Carrie would need to feel safe in future relationships. They talked about red flags and how Carrie's childhood had maybe taught her to accept less than she deserved. Because Cassie had modeled a certain kind of relationship dynamic after Carrie's father left. None of this excused what Cassie and Oliver did. Nothing could, but understanding the patterns helped Carrie feel less like a victim and more like someone actively choosing a different path forward. Dr. Carson also helped Carrie write a letter to Oliver and Cassie that she never sent, just for herself, to get all the anger and hurt and disappointment out of her system. The letter was 7 pages long and contained every ugly thought, every moment of rage, every question she wanted answered, but knew she'd never get closure on. When she finished writing it, she read it aloud to Dr. Carson in their session, and then she went home and burned it in her bathroom sink, watching the words turn to ash. The act felt primal and powerful, transforming pain into smoke and letting it dissipate into nothing. Around the 3-month mark, Carrie took up jogging. She'd never been a runner before, always found excuses not to exercise, but one morning she woke up with so much restless energy that she just put on sneakers and started running along Buffalo Bayou. She made it maybe half a mile before she had to stop, gasping for breath, her legs screaming. But the next day she went a little farther, and the day after that, farther still. There was something meditative about running, the rhythm of her feet hitting the pavement, the burn in her lungs, the way her mind would go quiet and just focus on the physical sensation of moving through space. She started running at dawn, watching the sun come up over the bayou, the water, reflecting pink and orange and gold, and those sunrise runs became sacred time. Just her and the city, and the promise that every day was a chance to start over. She also tried yoga. A co-worker at the magazine invited her to a class, and Carrie showed up skeptical, thinking it would be all incense and omming and people who were way more flexible than she could ever hope to be. And honestly, the first class was kind of a disaster. She couldn't hold half the poses, she fell over during tree pose, and she spent most of Savasana trying not to laugh at how ridiculous she felt. But the instructor, a woman named Yara with long locks and a serene smile, just kept saying, "Meet yourself where you are. This practice isn't about perfection, it's about presence. Meet yourself where you are." Carrie turned that phrase over in her mind for days. She'd spent so long trying to be perfect, the perfect fiancé, the perfect daughter, the perfect wife, that she'd forgotten how to just be herself, flaws and all. So she kept going to yoga, kept wobbling through the poses, kept learning that strength wasn't about never falling. It was about getting back up every time you did. One evening, about 4 months after the separation, Carrie sat down at her little kitchen table and lit a candle. She pulled out a notebook and wrote herself a letter. "Dear Carrie," it started, "remember your worth. You have survived something that would have broken a lot of people. You chose yourself when it would have been easier to stay. You're building a life that's honest and real and entirely yours. Keep going. The best parts of your story are still ahead." She signed it, dated it, and put it in an envelope that she kept on her nightstand. On hard days, she'd read it and remember the promise she'd made to herself. Time has this strange quality when you're healing. Some days feel endless, every hour dragging by while you wrestle with memories and what-ifs. Other days fly past in a blur of work and volunteering and choir practice, and therapy, and all the structures you've built to hold yourself together. But slowly, imperceptibly, the ratio shifts. The good days start outnumbering the bad ones. The moments of peace become more frequent than the moments of pain. You wake up one morning and realize you haven't thought about them in 2 whole days, and that small victory feels monumental. For Carrie, that shift happened around the 6-month mark. She woke up on a Saturday morning, made herself coffee, sat by her window, watching the museum district come to life, and realized she felt content, not happy, not yet, but content, satisfied with the life she was building, proud of how far she'd come, and that contentment felt like finding solid ground after months of drowning. Her life had developed a rhythm by then. Work at the magazine during the week, where she'd actually gotten promoted to senior. Writer and was now covering bigger stories, profiling more established artists. Choir practice on Wednesdays. Therapy with Dr. Carson on Thursdays. Volunteering with the kids on Saturday mornings. Church on Sundays. Runs along the bayou whenever she needed to clear her head. It was a full life. A good life. A life that was entirely hers. She'd also reconnected with old friends she'd lost touch with during the relationship with Oliver. Women from college who'd drifted away when Carrie got so absorbed in playing house. Former co-workers who'd invited her to happy hours that she'd always declined because she wanted to get home to Oliver. She reached out, made apologies for disappearing, and was amazed at how quickly they welcomed her back. People are more forgiving than we give them credit for, more willing to pick up where we left off, more understanding of how easy it is to lose yourself in a relationship. One of those reconnections was with a woman named Jasmine, who'd been in Carrie's sorority in college. They met for brunch one Sunday after church, and Jasmine told her own story of a bad relationship, a painful breakup, and the rebuilding process afterward. "The thing nobody tells you," Jasmine said, stirring sugar into her coffee, "is that you're not going back to who you were before. That person's gone. You're becoming someone new, and that's actually better, because this version of you knows things the old version didn't. This version can protect herself." Carrie held on to those words like a life raft. Around this time, Oliver tried one last time to contact her. He showed up at her apartment building one evening, buzzed her unit from downstairs. Carrie's heart jumped when she heard his voice through the intercom, that old familiar sound that used to mean safety and now just meant pain. "Carrie, please. I just want to talk. 5 minutes, please." And for a second, one brief, terrifying second, she considered it. Considered letting him up, hearing him out, seeing if there was anything left to salvage. But then she remembered the townhouse, remembered Cassie, remembered 5 months of lies after their wedding, remembered crying herself to sleep, wondering if she was going crazy for not trusting her own perceptions. And she pressed the button and said, clearly and firmly, "There's nothing left to say, Oliver. Please don't come here again." Then she released the button and walked away from the intercom. Her hands were shaking, but she felt strong. She'd held her boundary. She'd chosen herself. Again, he didn't come back after that. Carrie heard through mutual friends that he and Cassie were still together, still living in that townhouse, still trying to make their relationship work now that it wasn't a secret anymore. Part of her wondered if they'd make it, if their love would survive without the forbidden thrill of deception. But mostly, she didn't think about them at all. They'd become characters in a story about her past, not active participants in her present. Cassie tried to reach out too, sent long emails that Carrie deleted without reading, sent birthday cards that Carrie threw away unopened, showed up at the church once, but Aunt Florence intercepted her before she could approach Carrie. And whatever Florence said to her mother must have been effective because Cassie never came back. Eventually, the attempts at contact tapered off and then stopped entirely. Maybe they'd made peace with losing her. Maybe they'd convinced themselves they'd done all they could. Either way, the silence was a relief. 7 months after leaving, Carrie went to a gallery opening in Midtown for work. She was supposed to interview one of the artists for a profile piece. The gallery was crowded, full of Houston's art scene in all its eclectic glory. Gallery owners in designer suits, artists in paint-splattered jeans, collectors trying to look casual while clearly calculating prices. Carrie moved through the crowd with her notebook, taking notes on the pieces, observing how people interacted with the art. She stopped in front of a large abstract painting, swirls of deep blues and purples, with streaks of gold breaking through like sunlight through storm clouds. There was something about it that made her feel seen, like the artist had, somehow captured what the last 7 months had looked like in her heart. She stood there studying it, lost in thought, when a voice behind her said, "Beautiful piece, isn't it?" Carrie turned and found herself looking into a pair of warm brown eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled. He was tall, wearing a simple button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up, paint stains on his hands that suggested he was one of the artists. There was something about his energy, open, genuine, calm, that made her feel immediately at ease instead of guarded like she might have expected. "It is," she agreed, turning back to the painting. "There's something about the way the light breaks through, like hope emerging from chaos." He smiled wider. "That's exactly what I was going for." He extended his hand. "Jerome, I'm the artist. Well, one of them. I'm showing 3 pieces here tonight." "Carrie," she said, shaking his hand. His grip was warm and firm. "I'm with Art Scene magazine. I'm supposed to be interviewing you, actually." "Well then," he said, his eyes lighting up with amusement. "This is convenient. Though I have to say, most of my interviews don't start with someone actually understanding what I'm trying to express. You want to grab a coffee after this? Somewhere less loud where I can actually hear myself think?" And here's where the old Carrie might have panicked, might have made excuses, might have said she had to get home, even though she had nowhere to be, and nothing waiting for her except an empty apartment. But this new Carrie, the one who'd survived betrayal and built herself back from scratch, she surprised herself by saying, "Yeah, I'd like that." They ended up at a little coffee shop a few blocks away, open late for the Post, gallery crowd. They sat by the window and talked for 2 hours, and not once did it feel like an interview. Jerome told her about growing up in New Orleans, how the creative chaos of that city shaped his approach to art, how he'd moved to Houston 5 years ago and fallen in love with the city's energy, the way it was constantly reinventing itself. He talked about his work, about trying to capture emotional truths rather than literal representations, about believing that art should make you feel something, even if you couldn't articulate what that something was. Carrie found herself laughing at his jokes, at his story about accidentally ordering 70 pounds of clay instead of 7 and having to figure out what to do with it all. She told him about her work at the magazine, about discovering Houston's art scene when she first moved to the city, about how art had become a kind of therapy over the past year. She kept it vague, didn't mention Oliver or Cassie or any of the specific pain, but something in her tone must have conveyed that she'd been through something significant. "You know what I love about Houston?" Jerome said at one point, cradling his coffee cup. "It's a city of reinvention. People come here and become new versions of themselves. There's something hopeful about that, don't you think? The idea that you're not stuck with who you were, that you can always begin again." Carrie looked at him, at this stranger who somehow understood something essential about her journey without knowing any of the details, and felt something flutter in her chest. Not love, way too early for that, but possibility, the recognition that maybe, eventually, she could open herself up to someone new, that her story didn't have to end with betrayal, that there could be new chapters she hadn't even imagined yet. They discovered they both loved the color teal. "It's blue that decided to be interesting," Jerome said, which made Carrie laugh so hard she snorted her coffee. They both preferred breakfast for dinner. Both thought Houston summers were brutal, but the food scene made up for it. Both believed that art could change people's lives if they'd let it. The conversation flowed easy and natural, none of the performance or calculation that had characterized so much of her relationship with Oliver. When the coffee shop started closing up around them, Jerome walked her to her car. Under the streetlights of Midtown, he paused. "I really enjoyed talking with you tonight," he said. "I know you were supposed to be interviewing me for work, but would you want to do this again? Just us, no notebook, no article. Maybe dinner?" Carrie felt butterflies in her stomach, actual butterflies, the good kind that come from anticipation rather than anxiety. Part of her wanted to say no, to protect herself, to keep all the walls she'd so carefully constructed firmly in place. But another part of her, the part that had been doing yoga and running at sunrise and singing in the choir and slowly learning that she deserved good things, that part said, "Yes, I'd like that." She gave him her number, her hand barely shaking as she typed it into his phone. He promised to text her the next day to set something up, and then Carrie got in her car and sat there for a moment before starting the engine, her heart racing in the best possible way. Driving home through Houston's night, lit streets, she couldn't stop smiling. The city lights sparkled against the dark sky like promises, and Carrie thought about how far she'd come. 7 months ago, she'd been confronting her husband and mother in a townhouse built on lies. She'd been shattered, broken, convinced she'd never trust anyone again. But here she was, feeling excited about the possibility of getting to know someone new, feeling open instead of closed off, feeling hope instead of despair. She wasn't naive this time. She knew that just because Jerome seemed kind and genuine didn't mean he was perfect, or that a relationship with him would be easy, or that she wouldn't have to deal with her own trust issues that Oliver and Cassie had created. She knew healing wasn't linear, that she'd probably have moments of panic and doubt and fear, that opening her heart again was a risk. But she also knew something else, something she'd learned over 7 months of putting herself back together piece by piece. She was strong enough to handle whatever came. If things with Jerome didn't work out, she'd survive it. If he turned out to be someone other than who he seemed, she'd see the signs this time and walk away before it destroyed her. And if, and this was the scary, hopeful, terrifying thought, if things actually worked out, if he was who he seemed to be, then maybe she could have something real and honest and healthy, something built on truth instead of lies. The next morning, Carrie woke up to a text from Jerome. "Good morning. I haven't stopped thinking about our conversation last night. How's Thursday for dinner? There's this amazing Ethiopian place in the museum district I've been wanting to try." She read the text 3 times, smiling like an idiot, before responding, "Thursday works. I love Ethiopian food." She told Kendra about it over lunch that day, and Kendra's face lit up. "Girl, this is huge. Your first real date since everything happened. How do you feel?" And Carrie thought about it, really thought about it, checking in with her gut the way Dr. Carson had taught her. "Nervous," she admitted, "but also excited. Like I'm ready to try again, but in a different way this time. Does that make sense?" "Perfect sense," Kendra said, reaching across the table to squeeze her hand. "You're not the same person who started dating Oliver. You know yourself better now. You know what you deserve. And if this Jerome guy doesn't meet that standard, you'll know it early and you'll walk away." That's growth, honey. Thursday came, and Carrie found herself standing in front of her closet for way too long, trying to figure out what to wear. Not too dressy. She didn't want to seem like she was trying too hard. Not too casual. She wanted to look nice. Eventually, she settled on a simple blue dress that Jasmine had helped her pick out during a shopping trip the week before. "New life, new wardrobe," Jasmine had said, and Carrie had laughed but agreed. Most of her old clothes reminded her of the person she used to be, the one who'd tried so hard to be what Oliver wanted. This dress was just for her. Jerome picked her up at 7, and when she opened the door, his face lit up with a smile that made her stomach flip. "You look beautiful," he said simply, and something about the way he said it, genuine and straightforward, without being too intense, made her feel comfortable instead of self-conscious. Dinner was easy. They talked about everything: his MFA program at University of Houston, her early dreams of being a novelist, before she fell into journalism, their favorite places in the city, their worst cooking disasters. Jerome told her about the time he tried to impress a date by making homemade pasta and ended up with what he described as Italian-inspired, silly putty. Carrie laughed so hard she almost choked on her injera. She found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't expected to. There were moments when old anxieties would surface, when Jerome checked his phone. She'd feel a flash of suspicion before reminding herself that he was probably just checking the time or responding to a text, that not everyone was hiding something. When he mentioned an ex-girlfriend, she felt herself tense before realizing that having a past wasn't a red flag, it was just being human. She was learning to distinguish between healthy caution and trauma response, and that distinction was everything. Toward the end of dinner, Jerome looked at her thoughtfully. "Can I ask you something? And you don't have to answer if you don't want to." She nodded. "Last week at the gallery, when you talked about art being therapy, this past year, it sounded like you've been through something. I don't need to know what, but I want you to know that I see that you're healing from something. And I think that's brave." Carrie felt tears prick her eyes, unexpected and immediate. Nobody had said that to her. That healing was brave. Everyone focused on the breaking, on the betrayal, on what had been done to her. But Jerome saw the work she was doing, the active choice to rebuild, and he named it as courage. "Thank you," she managed to say. "That means more than you know. I've been through some stuff too," he said, his voice gentle. "Different circumstances, but I know what it's like to have to put yourself back together. So if you ever want to talk about it, I'm here. And if you don't, that's okay too. No pressure. I just want you to know that your past doesn't scare me. We all have one." And right there, in that Ethiopian restaurant in the museum district, Carrie made a decision. She could keep all her walls up, could protect herself by never letting anyone see the broken parts, or she could take a risk. Not a stupid risk. She'd be careful, take things slow, watch for red flags. But a calculated risk based on what her gut was telling her about this person in front of her. "I was married," she heard herself say, briefly. "It ended badly. There was betrayal involved, and it took me a while to trust my own judgment again. I'm still working on it, honestly. But I'm here with you tonight, because something about you feels safe, real, and I'm trying to learn how to trust that feeling again." Jerome nodded slowly. "Thank you for telling me that. I know that couldn't have been easy." He paused. "For what it's worth, I'm not in a hurry. We can take this as slow as you need to. I'm not going anywhere." They didn't kiss that night. When he walked her to her door, they hugged. A long, warm hug that felt comfortable and right, and he said he'd call her the next day. And he did. They started seeing each other regularly, but Carrie was careful to maintain her own life, her own rhythms. She kept going to choir practice, kept volunteering at the museum, kept seeing Dr. Carson, kept running at dawn. She'd learned the hard way what happened when you made someone else your whole world. Jerome respected that. He had his own art practice, his own friends, his own life that he'd built in Houston. They'd see each other a couple times a week, sometimes for dinner, sometimes just for coffee, once for a cooking class where they attempted to make Thai curry and ended up ordering takeout instead. He came to one of her choir performances and was genuinely moved by the music. She went to his studio and watched him work, fascinated by the way. He'd start with nothing and create something that made people feel. About 2 months into dating Jerome, Carrie had a session with Dr. Carson where she talked about how things were going. "I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop," she admitted. "I keep thinking I'm going to discover he's hiding something, or that I'm missing red flags, or that I'm being stupid again." Dr. Carson looked at her thoughtfully. "Carrie, can I ask you something? When you were with Oliver, did you have these kinds of doubts?" Carrie thought about it. "No. I mean, I had doubts after I caught them, but before that, I was so trusting I missed every sign." Dr. Carson nodded. "So your gut is actually working now. It's calibrated. The fact that you're being cautious isn't a sign that you're broken. It's a sign that you're wise. The question isn't whether you'll ever trust blindly again. You won't, and that's actually good. The question is whether you can trust carefully, while staying open to the possibility that good people exist." That conversation shifted something in Carrie. She realized she didn't need to choose between being completely closed off or being naively trusting. There was a middle path, being open but aware, hopeful but cautious, willing to risk but wise enough to see danger signs. And Jerome was giving her space to walk that middle path, never pressuring her, always respecting her boundaries, showing up consistently in small ways that built trust gradually over time. 3 months into their relationship, Jerome invited her to meet his family. His parents were visiting from New Orleans for the weekend, and he was having a small dinner at his place. "No pressure," he said, "but they'd love to meet you, and I'd love for you to meet them. They're a little loud, and my mom will definitely ask you 1,000 questions, but they're good people." Carrie said yes, even though the idea terrified her. Meeting the family felt significant, like crossing a threshold. But she also realized that if she kept saying no to anything that scared her, she'd be stuck forever. Growth meant doing things that frightened her while taking care of herself in the process. Jerome's parents were exactly as advertised, warm, loud, welcoming, and intensely curious about this woman their son was dating. His mother, Diane, hugged Carrie like they'd known each other for years. His father, Marcus, shook her hand and then also pulled her into a hug. They asked about her work, her family. She kept it vague, her life in Houston. They told embarrassing stories about Jerome as a kid that made him groan and made Carrie laugh until her sides hurt. At one point, while Jerome and his father were in the kitchen arguing about the proper way to make gumbo, Diane pulled Carrie aside. "I can tell my son really cares about you," she said softly. "And I can also tell you've been hurt before. I don't know the details and I don't need to. But I want you to know that Jerome is one of the good ones. He's not perfect, no one is, but he's honest and kind, and he'll treat you right. And if he ever doesn't, you call me, and I'll set him straight." She said it with such fierce maternal protection that Carrie felt tears spring to her eyes. "Thank you," Carrie managed. "That means a lot." And it did. It meant everything. To have someone vouch for Jerome's character, to have someone on her side, to feel welcomed and protected, it filled something in her she hadn't realized was empty. The relationship continued to develop slowly and steadily. They had their first real disagreement about 4 months in, something stupid about scheduling and miscommunication, and Carrie felt herself start to panic, waiting for the other shoe to drop, waiting for him to reveal his true colors. But instead, Jerome took responsibility for his part, apologized genuinely, and they talked through it like adults. No yelling, no gaslighting, no making her feel crazy for being upset. Just honest communication and resolution. And Carrie realized this is what healthy looks like. This is what she'd been missing. By the 6-month mark of their relationship, which was about a year after Carrie had left Oliver, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: peace. Not just contentment, but actual peace. She'd built a life she was proud of, a job she loved, friendships that sustained her, a spiritual practice that grounded her, hobbies that brought her joy, and now, a relationship that added to her life instead of consuming it. One Sunday after church, Aunt Florence pulled her aside. "Baby girl, I've been watching you these past months, and I want you to know something. I am so proud of who you've become. What Cassie and Oliver did to you was wrong. I won't ever say otherwise. But the way you've handled it, the way you've rebuilt yourself, the grace you have shown even while protecting yourself, that's the mark of real strength. Your grandmother would be so proud." Carrie hugged her aunt tight, crying happy tears for once. "Thank you for being there for me. For all of it." Aunt Florence pulled back and looked her in the eye. "That's what family does. Real family. The ones who show up when it's hard." Around this time, Carrie made a decision she'd been putting off. She filed for divorce. Oliver had been sending papers for months, and she'd been ignoring them, not ready to deal with the legal finality of it all. But now she felt ready. She signed everything, met with a lawyer to make sure she wasn't getting screwed in the settlement, and officially ended her marriage. When the final decree came through, she took Kendra out for champagne to celebrate. To new beginnings, Kendra toasted, raising her glass. And to never settling for less than you deserve again. They clinked glasses, and Carrie felt lighter than she had in over a year. That marriage was officially over. That chapter was closed. She could move forward without any legal ties to her past. She never heard from Oliver or Cassie after that. Occasionally she'd hear through the Houston grapevine that they were still together, that they'd gotten married themselves at some point. She felt nothing when she heard it. No anger, no jealousy, no vindication. Just a mild curiosity about how that had worked out, followed by genuine disinterest. They were characters in a story she'd finished reading. Their lives no longer intersected with hers. 8 months into dating Jerome, they took a weekend trip to Galveston. Carrie hadn't been back since the honeymoon, and part of her wondered if it would trigger painful memories. But she was tired of letting her past dictate which places she could visit, which experiences she could have. And she trusted Jerome enough to know that if she did get triggered, he'd be patient and supportive. They rented a beach house for the weekend, and on their first morning, they woke up early and walked along the beach at sunrise. The island breeze was warm and salty, and Carrie breathed it in, letting it fill her lungs. She thought about the last time she'd been here, trying so hard to believe that her marriage would work, forcing hope where there should have been certainty. And then she looked at Jerome beside her, picking up shells and making stupid jokes, and realized this was what it should feel like. Easy, natural, real. "You okay?" Jerome asked, noticing her quiet. "Yeah," she said, and meant it. "I'm really okay. Better than okay, actually. I'm happy." He smiled and took her hand. "Good. You deserve to be happy, Carrie. You know that, right?" And the wild thing was, she did know it now. She'd done the work to believe she deserved good things. She'd learned that her worth wasn't determined by who stayed or who left, by who chose her or who betrayed her. Her worth was inherent, unchangeable, solid. And once she truly believed that, everything else fell into place. That weekend in Galveston, they talked about the future, not in a scary, pressure-filled way, but in a natural conversation about what they both wanted out of life. Jerome talked about wanting to buy a house with a studio space where he could really spread out with his work. Carrie talked about eventually wanting to write a book, maybe fiction, definitely something that explored themes of resilience and reinvention. They talked about travel, places they wanted to see, experiences they wanted to have. Neither of them mentioned marriage or kids, and that was fine. They were building something at their own pace, without needing to rush toward societal checkpoints. By the time they drove back to Houston Sunday evening, Carrie felt something settle in her chest. This was it. This was the life she'd been building toward. Not perfect, nothing ever is, but honest, real. Hers. She'd lost so much over the past year and a half, but in losing it, she'd found herself. And that self was stronger, wiser, more whole than the woman who'd walked down that aisle convinced that love meant sacrifice and forgiveness meant tolerating betrayal. A few weeks after Galveston, Carrie was at the museum on a Saturday morning, helping with the kids' workshop. Maya, the little girl who'd been so scared to make bad art, was back, and she'd brought a friend. They were both painting with confidence now, mixing colors fearlessly, creating wild, abstract pieces that made Carrie smile. Maya looked up at her at one point and said, "Miss Carrie, you know what I learned? Sometimes you have to paint over the bad parts to make something good. My grandma taught me that." Carrie felt that sentence land in her soul. Sometimes you have to paint over the bad parts to make something good. Isn't that what she'd been doing? Taking the canvas of her life, looking at all the dark, ugly parts that Oliver and Cassie had painted there, and covering them with new colors, new experiences, new relationships, new dreams. The old stuff was still there underneath. She couldn't erase it, but she could transform it into something different, something that served her instead of haunting her. After the workshop, Carrie drove home thinking about transformation, about how she'd changed in the past year and a half. The woman who'd walked in on her mother and fiancé seemed like a stranger now, naive, desperate to believe the best about people even when they showed her the worst. But that woman had also been brave in her own way. She'd tried, she'd forgiven, she'd hoped. Those weren't weaknesses. They were acts of courage, even if they were ultimately misplaced. And this new version of Carrie had learned from that woman's mistakes without becoming cynical. She'd learned to trust her gut, to honor her boundaries, to walk away from anything that diminished her worth. But she'd also learned to stay open, to risk connection, to believe that good people existed even though bad ones had hurt her. That balance, that ability to be both wise and hopeful, that was the real victory. 1 year after leaving Oliver, Carrie threw herself a party. Not a big thing, just Kendra, her cousins, Aunt Florence, Jerome, Jasmine, a few other close friends. She made a toast. "A year ago today, I walked away from the biggest betrayal of my life, and I want to celebrate that. Not the betrayal, obviously, but the walking away, the choosing myself, the rebuilding. Every person in this room helped me do that in some way, and I'm grateful for all of you. Here's to new beginnings, to honest relationships, and to never settling for less than we deserve." Everyone cheered and clinked glasses, and Carrie looked around at these people who'd shown up for her, who had held her while she cried and celebrated with her as she healed, and felt overwhelmed with gratitude. This was her family now, not the one she'd been born into, but the one she'd chosen, the one that chose her back. Jerome pulled her aside later in the evening. "I got you something," he said, handing her a small wrapped package. She opened it to find a small painting, maybe 6 inches by 6 inches, of a sunrise breaking through storm clouds. "I painted this for you," he explained, "to remind you that light always comes. Sometimes it takes a while, and sometimes you have to weather the storm to see it, but it always comes." Carrie looked at that small painting, and then at Jerome, this man who'd been patient with her healing, who'd never pressured her, who'd shown her what healthy love could look like. "Thank you," she whispered, and kissed him softly. "For this, and for everything else." That night, after everyone left and Jerome had gone home, Carrie sat alone in her apartment with that painting in her hands. She thought about everything she'd been through, the discovery, the wedding, the honeymoon built on false hope, the slow realization that nothing had changed, the investigation, the confrontation, the darkness that followed. And then the light, the friends who showed up, the therapy that helped, the choir that gave her voice back, the children who taught her about creation, the running that cleared her mind, the yoga that taught her balance, and finally Jerome, who'd shown her that trust was still possible. She hung that small painting right next to her bed where she'd see it every morning, a reminder that she'd weathered the storm and found the light, that she'd chosen herself and built something beautiful from the broken pieces, that her story didn't end with betrayal. That was just the middle, the dark part that made the ending more meaningful. Because here's what Carrie learned through all of this. What I hope you I'll take with you from her story. Betrayal doesn't have to define you. Pain doesn't have to be permanent. The people who hurt you don't get to write the ending of your story. You do. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is walk away from what's familiar and build something entirely new. Something honest. Something yours. Carrie's story could have ended in bitterness and cynicism. She could have let what Oliver and Cassie did turn her cold and closed off. But instead, she chose differently. She chose to heal, to grow, to stay open to possibility even while protecting herself, to build a life so full and beautiful that the betrayal became just one chapter in a much longer, much more interesting story. 2 years after everything fell apart, Carrie stood in a gallery in downtown Houston for the opening of an exhibition she'd curated for the magazine. It was a show about resilience, artists who'd overcome trauma, addiction, loss, and transformed their pain into something beautiful. Jerome had a piece in the show, and so did several artists Carrie had profiled over the years. The gallery was packed with people, and Carrie moved through the crowd with confidence, introducing artists to collectors, explaining the themes of the work, feeling proud of what she'd created. At one point, she stood back and just observed. All these people engaging with art about survival and transformation. All these conversations about how humans can endure the worst things and still create beauty. And she realized this was her story too. She was one of these artists, in her own way. She'd taken the raw material of her pain and transformed it into a life worth living. Jerome found her in the crowd and squeezed her hand. "You did an amazing job with this show," he said. "Really, this is powerful work." She smiled at him, this man who'd become her partner in the truest sense. Someone who supported her dreams, respected her boundaries, showed up consistently, loved her honestly. "Thank you for being here," she said. "For all of it." Later that night, after the exhibition closed and they'd gone back to her apartment, she'd kept it, even though they'd talked about eventually moving in together. She needed space that was just hers. Carrie did something she hadn't done in a long time. She pulled out her phone and looked at old photos from before everything fell apart. Photos of her and Cassie, her and Oliver, back when she'd thought those relationships were real and solid and permanent. And for the first time, she could look at those photos without feeling rage or pain or regret. She could see the young woman in those pictures, the one who'd believed so hard, in love and family and forever, and feel compassion for her instead of anger. That woman had done the best she could with what she knew. She'd tried so hard. And yes, she'd made mistakes, stayed too long, forgiven too easily, ignored too many signs. But she'd also survived. And on the other side of survival, she'd found something better. Carrie put her phone away and looked around her apartment, at the life she'd built. The art on her walls, the books on her shelves, the small painting from Jerome beside her bed, the photos of her chosen family on the mantel, the evidence of a life lived fully and honestly, a life that belonged entirely to her. And she felt something she hadn't felt in years, complete peace. Not the absence of pain, but the presence of wholeness. She thought about where she'd been 2 years ago, broken, betrayed, convinced she'd never trust anyone again. And she thought about where she was now, healed, whole, in a healthy relationship, surrounded by people who truly loved her, doing work she was proud of, living a life that reflected her values. The journey between those 2 points hadn't been easy or linear. There had been setbacks and dark days and moments when she'd wanted to give up, but she'd kept going, kept choosing herself, kept believing she deserved better, and eventually, slowly, she'd built a life that proved she was right. So here's what I want you to understand. What Carrie's story teaches us. You can come back from betrayal. You can rebuild trust after it's been shattered. You can open your heart again after someone you loved has broken it. But it requires work, real, sustained, difficult work on yourself. It requires boundaries and therapy and support systems and time. It requires learning to distinguish between healthy caution and trauma response. It requires staying open while staying wise. It requires believing you deserve good things even when you've been treated badly. And most importantly, It requires choosing yourself over and over again, in big ways and small ways, in dramatic exits and quiet mornings, in saying no to what diminishes you and yes to what honors you, in walking away from lies and toward truth, in building a life that's authentically yours, instead of accepting crumbs from people who don't value you. Carrie Walker did that. She chose herself when it would have been easier to stay. She did the work when it would have been easier to become bitter. She stayed open when it would have been easier to close off. And on the other side of all that choice and work and courage, she found something precious, herself. The truest, strongest, most complete version of herself that had been there all along, just waiting for the right circumstances to emerge. 3 years after leaving Oliver, Carrie and Jerome got engaged. Not because she needed marriage to feel complete, and not because there was any pressure or timeline, but because, after years of building trust slowly and carefully, of showing up for each other consistently, of creating a partnership based on honesty and respect and genuine love, it felt like the natural next step. Jerome proposed on a beach in Galveston at sunrise, a deliberate choice to reclaim that place and make new, better memories there. "I know your past makes this complicated," he said, down on one knee with tears in his eyes. "I know you've been hurt, and that trust is something you've had to rebuild piece by piece. But I also know what I feel for you, and I know how I want to spend my life. With you, supporting your dreams, building something real and honest, growing old and making art, and arguing about the correct way to fold towels. I love you, Carrie. Will you marry me?" And Carrie, standing on that beach with the sunrise painting the sky gold and pink, looked at this man who'd shown her what healthy love looked like, who'd been patient with her healing, who'd never once made her feel like her caution was a burden. She thought about how far she'd come, about the woman who'd walked down an aisle 3 years ago to marry someone who'd never really chosen her, and about the woman she was now, strong enough to say yes to real love because she'd learned what real love actually looked like. "Yes," she said, laughing through tears. "Yes. Absolutely yes." They got married a year later in a small ceremony at her church, with only their closest people present. Aunt Florence wore another ridiculous hat and cried through the whole ceremony. Kendra was the maid of honor and gave a toast about resilience that made everyone teary. Jerome's parents welcomed Carrie into their family with open arms and fierce protection, and when Uncle Tony pronounced them husband and wife, Carrie kissed her new husband, knowing, really knowing, bone-deep knowing, that this time was different. This time was real. This time she wasn't ignoring red flags or forcing hope where there should be certainty. This time she was choosing someone who chose her back, honestly and completely. Their marriage wasn't perfect. No marriage is. They had disagreements and frustrations and days when they got on each other's nerves. But they had something more important than perfection. They had honesty, respect, communication, and genuine partnership. They had trust that had been earned through consistent action over years. They had a foundation built on truth instead of lies. And whenever things got difficult, they worked through it together instead of hiding or lying or betraying. Carrie kept her own name, kept her own bank account, kept her own space for her work. Not because she didn't trust Jerome, but because she'd learned that maintaining your own identity wasn't selfish. It was essential. And Jerome loved that about her. Loved her strength, her boundaries, her refusal to lose herself in a relationship ever again. He didn't want to consume her or control her. He wanted to build alongside her. And that made all the difference. 5 years after leaving Oliver, Carrie published her first book. It was a memoir about betrayal and healing, about losing yourself and finding yourself again, about learning to trust after trust has been shattered. She changed names and details to protect privacy, but the emotional truth was all there. The book was dedicated to everyone who's ever had to choose themselves. May you find the courage to walk away and the grace to rebuild. The book did well, not bestseller level, but solid sales and meaningful reviews. But more importantly, Carrie started getting emails from readers who saw themselves in her story. Women, mostly women, but some men too, who'd been betrayed by partners or family members, who'd stayed too long, who'd forgiven too easily, who'd lost themselves in trying to save relationships that weren't savable. They thanked her for showing them that you could come back from that healing was possible, that life could be good again. Reading those emails, Carrie understood why she'd had to go through everything she'd gone through. Not because the universe had some grand plan, or because betrayal builds character, or any of that toxic positivity nonsense, but because now she could help other people find their way through similar darkness. Her pain had purpose, not because the pain itself was good, but because she'd transformed it into something that could light the way for others. She did speaking events about resilience and healing. She went back to volunteering at the museum with the kids, now with her book published and more wisdom to share. She continued singing in the choir, her voice stronger than ever. She kept running at dawn and doing yoga and going to therapy, because healing is a practice, not a destination. She kept writing, kept creating, kept building a life that honored her truth. And through it all, Jerome was there, not as her savior, she'd saved herself, but as her partner, supporting her dreams, celebrating her victories, holding her on hard days, making her laugh when she took herself too seriously. They built a life together in Houston, bought a house with space for both his studio and her office, adopted a dog they named Houston, of course, created a home filled with art and books and love and laughter. Cassie reached out once, about 4 years after everything fell apart. A long email that Carrie almost deleted without reading, but something made her open it. Cassie apologized, took full responsibility for the betrayal, explained that she and Oliver had broken up. Apparently their relationship couldn't survive without the forbidden thrill of secrecy, and said she understood if Carrie never wanted to speak to her again, but wanted her to know that she was proud of everything Carrie had accomplished. She'd read the book. She'd seen the speeches online. She knew Carrie had built something beautiful from the ashes of what Cassie had helped destroy. Carrie read that email 3 times. And then she wrote back, not a long response, just a few lines. "Thank you for the apology. I've forgiven you. Not for you, but for myself. I don't know if we'll ever have a relationship again, but I hope you've found peace. Take care of yourself." She sent it and felt lighter. Not because she was ready to reconcile, but because she'd extended grace without compromising her boundaries. She'd acknowledged Cassie's humanity without letting her back into her life. And that balance, that ability to forgive without forgetting, to have compassion without reconnection, that was wisdom. 10 years after walking away from Oliver, Carrie stood in her backyard at a summer barbecue. Jerome was grilling, arguing with his father about the proper way to season ribs. Kendra was there with her girlfriend, laughing at some joke Aunt Florence had just made. Carrie's cousins were playing with Houston the dog, and their kids were running through the sprinklers. Jerome's artist friends were debating the merits of various Houston galleries. And Carrie looked around at this chosen family, this life she'd built, and felt overwhelmed with gratitude. This was it. This was what she'd been fighting for during those dark months after the betrayal. This sense of belonging, of being known and loved truly, of having people in her life who showed up and stayed and chose her every day. This was what real family looked like. This was what real love looked like. And it had only been possible because she'd been brave enough to walk away from the fake versions. Late that night, after everyone had gone home, and she and Jerome were cleaning up, he put on some music and pulled her into a slow dance in their kitchen. No special reason, just because. And as they swayed together, Carrie thought about young Carrie, the one who'd walked in on her mother and fiancé all those years ago. She wanted to tell that woman, "I know it hurts. I know it feels like the end of everything. I know you can't see past this moment, can't imagine ever feeling whole again. But I promise you, you will survive this. You will rebuild. You will find real love and real family and a real life worth living. You will be okay. Better than okay. You will thrive." And then Carrie looked up at Jerome, at this man who'd shown her what partnership should look like, and she smiled. Because she had thrived. She'd taken the worst thing that ever happened to her and used it as fertilizer to grow something beautiful. She'd transformed betrayal into wisdom, pain into purpose, endings into new beginnings. And if she could do it, anyone could. That was the truth she wanted to share with the world. That was the message of her book, her speeches, her life. You are stronger than you think, healing, is possible, and the story doesn't end with betrayal. That's just where a new, better story begins. So here's what I want to leave you with today. Carrie's story isn't special because she had some superhuman strength or because she was lucky enough to meet the perfect person. It's special because she made a choice, the same choice available to anyone who's been betrayed or broken or hurt. She chose to do the work. She chose to heal instead of staying bitter. She chose to stay open instead of closing off. She chose herself over and over again until she'd built a life that reflected her worth. And you can make that same choice. Whatever betrayal you're facing, whatever pain you're carrying, whatever broken pieces you're trying to put back together, you can choose healing. It won't be easy. It won't be quick. It will require support and therapy and time and sustained effort. But it's possible. Carrie did it. Thousands of people who read her book and saw themselves in her story are doing it. And you can too. Because here's the final truth. Your worth isn't determined by who stays or who leaves, by who chooses you or who betrays you. Your worth is inherent, unchangeable, solid. And once you truly believe that, once you internalize it so deeply that no one else's actions can shake it, everything changes. You make different choices. You accept different treatment. You build different relationships. You create a different life. A life that honors the truth of who you are. A life that's authentically, powerfully, beautifully yours. Carrie Walker found that life. And under the Houston sky that had witnessed her pain and her healing, her breaking and her rebuilding, she stepped forward into each new day, stronger, wiser, and ready for whatever came next. Not because her past didn't matter, but because she refused to let it define her future. And that refusal, that choice, that courage, that's what transforms victims into survivors and survivors into people who thrive. The end of Carrie's story isn't an ending at all. It's a beginning. The beginning of a life built on truth, sustained by love, and defined by the unwavering belief that she deserved everything good that came her way. And she did. And you do too. Now I need something from you, and I need you to really think about this because your answer matters, not just to me, but to everyone else reading these comments. Carrie's story raises a question that I think a lot of us wrestle with. Is forgiving someone who deeply betrayed you an act of strength, or is it just setting yourself up to be hurt again? Because here's the thing. Carrie forgave them initially, and it backfired catastrophically. But then years later, she forgave them again for her own peace. So which version was right? When is forgiveness weakness? And when is it wisdom? I want you to drop a comment right now with your honest answer. Not what sounds good, not what you think you should say. What do you actually believe based on your own life experience? Have you ever forgiven someone who betrayed you? How did it turn out? Are you still carrying pain from something you haven't forgiven? Talk to me. Share your story, even if it's just a sentence or two. And here's why this matters. There are people reading these comments right now who are in Carrie's situation. Maybe not the exact details, but they're wrestling with betrayal, trying to figure out if they should stay or go, wondering if they're strong enough to rebuild. Your story, your perspective, might be exactly what they need to hear to make their own choice. So don't just consume this content, contribute to it. Make this comment section a place where real people share real wisdom about surviving real betrayal. Before you go, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because next week I'm bringing you a story about a man who discovered his entire life was someone else's elaborate con. And the question at the heart of that story is going to mess with your head for days. You're not going to want to miss it. This is Stories by Mr. Gideon, where we don't just tell stories, we excavate them, examine them, and learn from them together. Drop that comment, share your truth, and I'll see you in the next one.